the law is actually changing to address these concerns and protect consumers in more demanding ways. And ultimately, all of those factors mean that tech companies themselves are starting to shift their strategy to meet these demands and meet these kind of shifting market dynamics.
Hey gang, it's Thursday, May 27th. Sarah and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. I'm Marcus. I'm joined today by Sara M. Watson, who is one of our senior analysts covering connectivity and tech.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me, Marcus.
Hey Sarah, thanks for joining us. Today's fact, nearly all species, nearly all of them, to have ever existed on Earth are extinct. So we walk on an Earth that has seen the extinction of 99.9% of all the species who've ever lived on it, according to PBS. That means we're technically in the 0.1%. After hearing this, I got hyper-vigilant. I don't know why. I started looking around me as if, just maybe I was being hunted. I felt like I was in Jumanji.
Survival of the fittest, Marcus.
Yeah, didn't feel good about that. I thought, there's a couple of things which are gone now, which is a shame. But most of them are here. No, they're all gone. So it's every person for themselves. Okay. On that light note, today, the real value of privacy and survival. I'm just kidding. So, at the end of 2020, Sarah, we published our 10 key digital trends for 2021 report. Trend number 2 in that report was written by you, I believe.
One version of it, yeah.
One version of it, yes. It was a collaborative effort on the 10 key digital trends for 2021, and certain analysts had weighed in on certain trends. And so, Sarah, covering privacy for us, you had worked on the trend that predicted a federal privacy law will pass this year. You pointed to a few things. Number 1, an incoming Biden administration that was favorable towards the idea of privacy, federal privacy bill. Number 2, some March 2020 survey data by Performix and Northwestern University's Intent Lab showing 7 out of 10 US adults favored some government regulation on how companies treat personal data. And number 3, the fact that Prop 24 passed in California, further cementing the state's commitment to consumer privacy legislation. Sarah, 5 months into 2021, what are we thinking? Privacy law before the year's out?
So I will hedge a little and say, I don't know about this year, but absolutely in the very near future, because, and this is why I think this, we've not only seen, Prop 24 in California, we have also seen Virginia pass a privacy law, and that really starts to put the pressure on the patchwork that, industry always hates when it comes to legislation. And when you're talking about the digital economy and, cross-border data transactions happening, it's not a great look to have a bunch of different privacy laws across the United States, let alone across international contexts too. So other states like Washington, Oklahoma, Florida, they're all getting further and further along, pushing these state-level privacy, either bills or laws into legislation. And so that's really going to start to put the pressure on the need for a federal solution.
Right.
So, but that being said, I do think there's a really interesting counterintuitive thing happening right now, which is these state laws are actually being somewhat bankrolled by the tech firms and their lobbying bodies, right? The tech firms want there to be a federal standard. However, in the meantime, they are pushing state laws to increase the diversity of options of different models for what a federal privacy standard might look like. So they're looking at California and saying that's a little bit too strenuous, too strict, too stringent. That's not quite what we want. So they're actually bankrolling all these other alternatives, including the one in Virginia, that are slightly more industry friendly. They don't include things like a private right of action, whether consumers can sue companies for their privacy violations. They also, tend to focus more on opting out rather than opting in, which is, again, a far more aggressive consumer protection stance. So I think, I will say, I don't know that it'll happen this year, but I think the bills that will push that forward will absolutely be introduced in this year, and we might see it next year.
So you mentioned Virginia. Mm-hmm. Was that the one that you at the top? Yeah. Okay. So that was passed their own privacy law in February?
Yes, that's right.
Right. Okay. And then start of April, Colorado became the latest state to consider a comprehensive consumer privacy law?
That's right. Yeah. And there's basically almost every state in the nation is talking about something.
Right.
It's just a matter of what stage it's in. It's in committee, it's in, deliberations, it's proposed, whatever. So.
Okay. They do seem to be popping up all over the place. So another reason to think that it's going to be this year or soon is because there are some versions that are being worked on, right? Insider intelligence analyst Daniel Carnahan was noting last month that, quote, Congress is currently reviewing at least 3 different proposals for a comprehensive federal privacy law, close quote, saying as recently as March 20th, McKenna Kelly of The Verge reported that senators were rolling out a bipartisan data privacy bill that would require platforms to write their terms of service agreements in plain language so users understand what they're accepting by using the platform. And if a site suffers a data breach, it would have to notify users within 72 hours of it occurring, sounding very GDPR-esque. One of the bills, the Information Transparency Personal Data Control Act, gives folks the power to opt into sharing, as you mentioned, the idea of opting in to sharing and selling of some types of data versus having to opt out of everything. But the bill doesn't explicitly give people the right to access, change, or delete their information a company has collected about them. The CCPA does. Question, what are the chances that a federal privacy bill is actually less comprehensive than the state level legislation that already exists, like the laws of California? Like we see a watered down federal bill, and so actually there's still this patchwork because California is more strict and Florida's maybe more strict, etc.
Yeah, well, so I think there's 2 parts to answer that question. One is, yes, I do think it's likely that we may see a less stringent legislation at a federal level because of all these kind of lobbying efforts across different states. And so basically putting out alternatives that are less stringent than California, as we just talked about. What I think is still really up for grabs is whether or not states will preempt the federal solution, right? So if California is already in play, will that supersede or preempt the federal law, or will it not? And I think that's going to shake out in all the kind of deliberations about which bill actually goes forward.
Right. It's a big deal. Number 1 challenge among marketers for privacy compliance, making sure their lists comply with GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, Europe's privacy rules, or the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, advertiser perceptions, saying that October 2020. Sara, you just wrote about privacy in your new report, Privacy as a Competitive Advantage. Early on in the report, you write that there's a market for privacy. You note that consumer attitudes have evolved beyond the privacy paradox idea that users' thirst for privacy doesn't always match their actions on privacy. And you say that privacy-conscious consumers are willing to spend time and money to protect their data and identify trustworthy companies. How so?
Yeah, so this was actually a really interesting finding from this report is a Cisco survey. So historically, we've always had lots of data of consumers saying that they want more privacy, like they like privacy, they want it. But when they actually make choices in the market, we just see them handing everything over to Facebook. And
people are lazy.
Yeah, people are lazy. The trade-offs are good enough. But I actually think there hasn't been true choice for consumers. And so that's part of the problem of asking these types of questions in surveys.
Right. I'm of course kidding. It's very complicated. For a lot of people to even understand what they're even opting into. So
totally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So what was interesting about this Cisco survey, they actually broke out the question, okay, do you say you care about privacy? Yes, 9 out of 10 consumers say they care. Worldwide, they say they care about privacy. They care about protecting others. They want more control, right? But Cisco went on to ask this follow-up question, which is, I'm willing to act. I'm willing to spend money and time to protect my data. It's actually a buying factor for me. And I expect to pay more to protect my privacy. And so 9 out of 10 consumers say that they care. 7 out of 10 say that they're actually willing to act to protect their privacy. And so that's a really big, significant shift in attitudes and distinction. And lastly, the most interesting factor to me is that 3 out of 10 consumers say they actually switched companies or providers over their data policies or over their data sharing practices. So people are voting with their feet. They're actually making choices to move from one provider to another based on their data privacy practices. So that seems like a pretty big, significant shift to mark a maturity of consumer demand and privacy.
So I looked at that, not paying a ton of attention to, specifically to privacy the way you do. And I saw that and I thought, oh, actually, that looks like the privacy paradox to me. 90% of people say they care, 70% of people say I'm willing to act, and 30% you could say a considerable amount. 30% of people said that they've acted already. So you look at that number and say, actually, we've come a long way. That number would never have been 30% a few years ago.
Yeah, and I think that's really what I'm getting at, is that over, the past 10 years, like in terms of where we were in awareness, consumer awareness about these issues has dramatically increased. And therefore, consumers are looking for something different, and then also making changes based on those requirements. So.
Right. And we're talking about a long-term shift here. I'm actually going to catapult forwards quickly to one of your best practices from your report on how to differentiate on privacy. You make the point that in one of your best practices, value changes require cultural shifts. This is not going to happen overnight.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think that's really what this stat is an indication of, right? Like, this is a very long shift that requires a lot of different factors to come into play. I think what is really interesting in this moment particularly is that we have the demand coming from all different directions, right? We have this increased consumer demand for alternative data structures and policies. We're also seeing the fact that norms are shifting, right? Consumer expectations about how tech firms are handling their data have shifted. We are seeing a drop in trust in tech firms over the past few years, both from a societal perspective, but also in terms of their business models and business practices when it comes to data. And then, of course, we have law shifting. So we're, the pressure from GDPR and CCPA and all of these kind of patchworks that we've just been talking about. The law is actually changing to address these concerns and protect consumers in more demanding ways. And ultimately, all of those factors mean that tech companies themselves are starting to shift their strategy to meet these demands and meet these kind of shifting market dynamics. And so the rest of the report really gets into how tech firms are starting to look at changing how their products and their code is structured to try to protect privacy and try to address consumers' concerns about how they handle data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's seasonal climate change. Spring doesn't happen all at once. You start to notice the leaves coming back. You start to notice that maybe you don't need that light jacket, and then eventually you get to summer. It doesn't happen overnight unless you live in New York, and then it happens immediately in half a second. Just summer, straight away.
80 degrees this week, one day.
80 degrees immediately. Go, really
Boom.
Go.
But yeah, I think part of the reason for writing this report was seeing the tech firms actually start to talk about this as a strategic initiative, right?
Yep.
Seeing Amazon's Alexa director of trust talking about, privacy being a feature for Alexa devices. Every time a product feature is released, there is a equivalent privacy feature that they're rolling out. Or hearing Andrew Bosworth of Facebook Reality Labs talking about maybe our whole entire business model has been based on collecting data, selling ads on data as Facebook, right? Maybe we understand we have a reputation problem based on that structure. Maybe as we imagine the next phase of computing interfaces, we need to reset and rethink those assumptions about what our business model looks like and how much we take data maximization for granted. And so he has written a memo that's basically saying that, what if we start from the assumption that we have to earn the ability to collect data, and what's the minimum amount of data that we need to provide the service in our AR, XR, whatever interface. And so that seems, when you start to hear the tech leaders and leadership talking in those terms, basically acknowledging the privacy landscape changing, the legislative landscape changing, but also the kind of strategic landscape changing as well.
So you go into those two examples a lot of detail in your report. You outline 4 case studies on how some companies are building trust in emerging technologies through privacy. Which ones to you stood out as the most interesting?
Yeah, so I think the one I'd love to talk through a little bit is Amazon Alexa. They're actually one of the reasons that prompted this report back at CES. Ann Toth was this director of Amazon Trust was talking about her role in Amazon Trust and the fact that, a whole division of the company was dedicated to establishing trust and building privacy features and kind of thinking holistically about the product rollout and importance of these features really spoke to me and said something about like, okay, there's something going on here. There's a pattern shift in how tech firms are even thinking about their strategy here. And so, yeah, that's where I wanted to spend a little time today, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, talk us through it.
Yeah. So, I mean, we all know Alexa, right? We all know Amazon smart speaker devices, the Echo and the Dot. So Amazon, of course, has really led the charge getting these smart speaker devices into our homes, into our most intimate spaces. And in fact, the most common place people have these devices in their bedrooms. So, that's a pretty intimate space, right? But also these devices are always listening. And, from a trust perspective, you have to have a certain expectation of what I'm getting out of this is going to be a good enough benefit to merit allowing that level of access to my life, right? And so Anne says that the future for Amazon Alexa is not possible unless we earn and continually re-earn our customers' trust in us. And that's really the thrust of the way that they're approaching this question. Obviously, not everyone has a smart speaker yet. Only 27% of US consumers have smart speakers. And so there is still, it's still a very nascent market. Amazon currently has 66% of the smart speaker market in the US. So they're in a market dominant position, but they know that they have to maintain trust to stay in that position. And that's really what it comes down to. And it's also about, how do you reach the rest of those consumers who still say the reason that they don't own a smart speaker is that, 66% say that they're bothered by the fact that smart speakers are always listening. 58% say they don't trust companies that make smart speakers to keep their information secure. So there are, barriers to entry for the rest of that, population in terms of market maturity. So that's the challenge.
Yeah.
The strategy, again, is really putting a lot of effort into building trust through the user interactions, the UX, the UI kind of features, including things like, the importance of the wake word, right? You say, right, Alexa, to initiate the conversation, the ring around the light, the speaker goes off and there's a ding and it, you're interacting, right? Like there's a clear indication of, it's listening now, it's acting, it's going to process your information. And that is distinct from, the always buffering kind of ready to be listening, right? And that being really important, right? Like that was a new thing to introduce consumers to as a product feature. They're also talking about things like baking in explainability. So being able to ask Alexa, why did you do that? Being a really important thing when you don't have an interface to look at, the history of your Amazon Alexa device unless you, go back into the, the desktop or the mobile app and, in the room, how do you figure out what's going on, right? So having prompts that you can ask. And lastly, they're, giving users more control. So they're allowing you to say, delete everything from the last 15 minutes or everything from the last year. Obviously, historically, Alexa has kept some of those recordings for, improving the product and making the product work. But users are now given the controls to say, actually, I don't want you to use that to improve the product. We're going to wipe that, get rid of the history. So
yeah, voice is just a different type of medium voice. And when you're speaking to a device, especially ones without screens, some smart speakers do have them, like the show devices, but some don't. And so it's just something less tangible about it. You can't see what's going on. There's no, waiting for you to type on a keyboard or use a mouse or swipe on your smartphone to input information. It's taking your voice. And it just is much more intimate, much more kind of omnipresent type of medium. You mentioned in your answer, you were talking about Amazon saying they have a whole team dedicated to trust and privacy. I mentioned one of your best practices was, value changes requiring cultural shifts. This is going to take a long time. Putting privacy doesn't happen overnight. You write, you say dedicated cross-functional teams. You need those to oversee privacy-centric thinking across the organization, talking about establishing processes, performance metrics that prioritize and value consumer privacy. That's one of the best practices that you highlight. You list a ton of best practices in this report on how to differentiate on privacy. I'm going to ask you to try and give me just one more.
So I think this one is a tricky one, but I think it's really important and is increasingly important. And that is to be honest about the business model. I think consumers are aware that there is an exchange in, the fundamental value of I hand over my personal data to either have a free service or to, get a better product recommendation, right? And I think, there is an increasing awareness of that exchange. And I also think, increasingly as the legislative model shifts towards a first-party data relationship, we're starting to see a lot of other companies get into exploring how they can derive value from first-party relationships and first-party data. That means a company like Amazon is exploring, becoming an even bigger advertiser, right? Whether it's in terms of, product placement, recommendations, et cetera, right? So in the Amazon Alexa model, right, how do you know as a consumer when Amazon Alexa is presenting an advertisement? Do you have a clear indication of when the answer to what you asked is a sponsored ad, or is it, the best answer to your question? And so this gets back to the bigger question is like, as these data practices change business models, right? We're going to start seeing more advertising in some places, more subscription models in other places. Do you have a clear communication with the consumer what the business model is based on this data? And I think that's going to be increasingly important. I think it's a conversation that not a lot of people are willing or ready to have, but I think it's going to be increasingly important.
My favorite was take first party responsibility seriously.
Yeah.
That was a really good one, saying, just because you have that relationship, don't take it for granted. I thought that was a really good one. Really quickly, to close out the lead story, whilst we've got you here, you cover privacy for us. Your take on Apple's iOS 14.5 app tracking transparency feature. How do you see this playing out in the coming months? I think we spoke last week on the Weekly Listen about it with a couple of folks, but what's your take on everything that's going on?
Yeah, so I think two things. One is, Apple is, and I talk about this in the report, that they're really kind of pushing a new standard on the industry by requiring opt-in rather than opt-out. And I think, they're kind of getting ahead of legislation by doing that. But that, of course, is creating all kinds of problems for everyone in the ecosystem. And that's why we're all so concerned. I do think it's interesting that, they're taking a stand and, pushing this forward. I also am interested in, what are the stakes for Apple in doing so, right? Like, they're not doing it just to be a consumer-friendly, privacy-protecting company, right? How do they stand to benefit? If the advertising model goes away for apps, where does it go? It goes to subscriptions, and it goes to Apple making their 15 or 30% cut out of these subscription apps, right? Or in-app purchases, right? So, it's not completely out of the goodness of their hearts that they're like protecting consumers here. They also stand to benefit. So that's one thing. I think the other thing that's super interesting to me that we talked about last week is I think you're going to start seeing a big disparity in the app tracking that consumers will allow in certain contexts. And so we'll start to see some granularity about, maybe they're willing to, subsidize Facebook with app tracking for advertisements, but they might not be willing to do so for fitness tracking apps, right? And I think we're going to start to see, the delineations of what types of data consumers are comfortable with tracking, where they expect tracking to be okay and an expectation, and where they're going to start to draw new lines because they can.
And that wraps up the first half of the show. Unfortunately, it's time now for the halftime report, where we summarize the key takeaways from the lead story in 30 seconds or fewer before in other news in the second half of the show. Sarah, your takeaways from the first half are...
My big takeaway is that this is a really interesting moment for privacy for all of these reasons that we've talked about. And I think, we're going to see it's a long shift, but it is also a really interesting kind of inflection point right now.
Terrific. Well, that's all we've got time for the lead story. It's time now for In Other News. But first, we're going to say goodbye to Sarah. Unfortunately, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us for the lead story.
Thanks for having me, Marcus.
Of course. Now, a quick word from our sponsor, VTEX, before the second half. Retail's next competitive threat may come from a business model or channel that didn't even exist a few months ago. This modern dynamic requires companies to adapt quickly, pivoting business seemingly overnight, something traditional commerce platforms just can't support. There's a new enterprise commerce platform on the rise, one that's fast, flexible, and doesn't require 9 months and $1 million to get up and running. Go to vtex.com/emarketer to learn more. All right, folks, we are back. It's time now for In Other News. Joining me today for In Other News is our analyst on the payments and commerce team. It's Daniel Keyes.
Hey, Marcus.
Hey, chap. Thank you so much for joining us for the second half of the show. Today in Other News, how have the major retailers been doing so far this year, and what does that say about retail? Google is planning to open its first physical retail store, and kids can now shop online by themselves. Story one. How have the major retailers been doing so far this year? Walmart managed total revenue growth of nearly 3%, beating expectations, and online sales growth of nearly 40%, pointing to grocery as a big reason why. Online sales last Q1 2020 were over 70%, so over 70 last year, 40% this year. Target's online sales were up 50%, down from the heights of triple-digit growth they experienced in Q1 2020. Total revenue was up over 20%. And Home Depot also recorded a good quarter thanks to increases in big-ticket sales, as folks' willingness to spend on home improvement remained high, as well as high lumber prices. Daniel, what do these larger retailer Q1 results tell us about the health of the broader retail market and its recovery?
I mean, it's a very good sign. The numbers for this quarter are a little bit confusing because they're being compared to Q1 last year, which in the US was the beginning of the pandemic and the back end of it. So, suddenly there was, depending on the retail, there were less sales, or people were stocking up on paper towels and other similar goods, and everyone was buying stuff online because it was being the pandemic. So it's hard to really get to the bottom of these numbers. But the fact that they're all growing over that quarter is a very good sign. And I know that some of them also reported stacked numbers for the past 2 years over the previous years. And it's really impressive growth numbers there as well. So they're trending very positively. And to be able to maintain growth in Q1 of this year, as things are not all settled down, but they're obviously in better shape than they were a year ago, to keep growing, especially your e-commerce business, but keep growing overall, points to a very strong year, or at least the beginning of a very strong year for these retailers.
Mm-hmm. Story 2. Google is planning to open its first physical retail store in New York City's Chelsea neighborhood. The general public will be able to go in starting this summer. What the devil are they going to sell? Well, they did complete their Fitbit acquisition at the start of the year. They bought the smart home products company Nest 7 years ago. And they, of course, sell the Google Pixel smartphones and Pixelbook laptops. Chaim Gartenberg of The Verge notes that similar to Apple stores, the new Google retail shop will not only sell products, but will also repair items, offer in-store experts to troubleshoot problems, and feature how-to workshops. Daniel, what does this say about Google and brick-and-mortar retail more generally?
For Google, it's an attempt to to make their products more appealing to consumers, giving them an additional point of contact, which is worth a shot, but it is only one store. And I'm sure if it works, they'll add more. I'm a little skeptical because I don't know that consumers necessarily want this for Google products, but then again, they do often for Apple products. So that could work for Google. It does feel like maybe too little too late. If they had done this years ago, it might have had a better chance of taking off. And as far as brick and mortar goes, it does show that Google might be taking this opportunity because, rent is not so low for a store. Google has plenty of money, but they might see an opportunity to break into brick and mortar because there's a lot more store openings than there used to be. But it also shows that brick and mortar does still have value if you deploy it correctly. I don't know if these Google stores will actually create a valuable experience, but Google clearly thinks they could. You can use brick and mortar to interface with consumers in a different way. They can be more personal and more valuable than maybe talking to someone online or via chat. So there's clearly still utility. I just don't know if Google will use it appropriately.
You just touched on it. You said it's maybe too little too late. That was my first reaction, was what took them so long? Did that surprise you that it took them this long to open a store?
It does. I mean, Google's added more products in recent years, so maybe they only recently decided it was more worth it. Because when it did, Google's been more just a search engine for a long time, but you don't need a store for a search engine. As they get into more and more products, to Fitbit, like you mentioned, it makes more sense. But you still think maybe they would have tried this previously. Then again, Microsoft has been doing it for a while and it hasn't really done much for them. So maybe they were right to wait. I'm not sure.
True. Story 3. Kids can now shop online by themselves. New York-based toy retailer Camp NYC has a new feature called the Present Shop, which lets parents or just friends and family give kids a little pot of money online so they can choose gifts and check out without any further supervision. The adult just adds payment and shipping information, and the child is off to the races with an animated bear to help guide them through the site. Why do this? The company chief executive and co-founder Ben Kaufman said that Present Shop is meant to echo giving kids money to spend at the mall. Camp executives stressed that the new feature complies with the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPA, the federal law that makes websites acquire parental consent before collecting data on kids under 13. Camp says that they then anonymize any data they collect. Daniel, kids now being able to shop online by themselves, is this a big, little, or medium deal?
I think it's a medium deal. I think this one move is a little deal, but I think it could become bigger over time. As they made the comparison, giving kids money at the mall or letting kids pick things out at the grocery store, that's a long time thing. This is making a digital version of that, which is going to appeal to kids, certainly, and maybe some parents who'd like to give their kids a little bit of independence or teach them the value of money, have them buy stuff. There's some value there. And it's an opportunity really for retailers to establish a direct relationship with children really early on. When parents buy something for the kids, that's great. The kid doesn't necessarily, really recognize the brand or care about it. But if kids are the one buying it, that means they're interacting with the advertising, they're considering the products, and maybe that'll create a relationship that the brands and the retailers can, use to their advantage for years to come. Is that a little bit uncomfortable on an ethical level? I think maybe, but I understand the value of it for retailers. I'm surprised at the lack of supervision. Because, when you give kids money in a mall, obviously the parents, if they're not with them, can't stop the kid from buying something because they're away. But I'm shocked, honestly, that a kid can't put something in their cart, say, I want to buy this with the money you've given me, and then the parents don't get a final opportunity to check it off and agree. Because it seems like digital would really allow for that. That obviously takes away for the independence from kids, but it seems like digital would actually allow more supervision without really being too hands-on. So that's something I could imagine someone adding in the future.
Yeah, because even with your Amazon order, you hit buy, but then they let you know a few seconds afterwards that yes, it went through. Or with Airbnb, you hit yes, I'd like to book here, and then it approves it and confirms it a few minutes later. So I don't think that step would be too bothersome for kids. Amazon kind of has something similar. So they've been offering a similar service for the last 4 years. Anne-Marie Alcantara of the Wall Street Journal was saying it's aimed at older kids and their teens, and parents can approve every order or set spending limits. Before we hit record, Victoria, who edits the show, she was telling us about a kid. I think I understand this correctly. He bought 6,000 boxes of SpongeBob ice cream. Is that what she said? A pallet's worth?
Pretty much, yeah.
Of ice cream.
It's a lot of ice cream.
Online with his parents' Amazon account.
And you can't really return ice cream.
You can't return ice cream, no. You have to eat it as fast as humanly possible. That is a disaster. As I was saying to you guys before, I'd have got rid of him. I don't know if you can give kids back. I don't know if that's a service that is offered. This is why I'm not a parent. That was all our stories. That went so fast. I was ready to go. I was ready for more. That's it. That's all the stories. We did 3 already. That's all we've got time for today's episode. Thank you, Daniel, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you to Sarah, who joined us for the first part of the show. Thank you to Victoria, who edits the show. Thank you so much to everyone who took time to listen in. We'll see you guys tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Weekly Listen, a new marketer podcast made possible by VTEX. Really quickly, you spell your name the way I would pronounce Sara. Is Sara a name in America?
Not in America, no.
Oh, okay. All right, that's good to know. I'm always unsure.
I mean, yes, there are people who would pronounce it that
No.
way.
No. Sarah has spoken. There's no Saras. If you are a Sara and you're listening, please leave. Okay. Out you go.
I'll accept it. I like it. It sounds fancier than
Sara?
Yeah.
Oh, I guess it does, yeah. You can be called whatever you want. If you want to mix it up later on, let me know.